Well, welcome to our final week of discussion for the Civil War course. We're going to be wrapping up Reconstruction, rather, and we're going to be talking about really the loose ends of Reconstruction and to really think about whether or not Reconstruction was a success, a failure, or somewhere in between. And before we get started, I just want to talk a little bit about the fact that, this really is what this course is about. At a 400 level course, it really isn't about you guys like regurgitating material back to me, right? It really is you guys taking this material, understanding it for yourself, and making it your own, and coming up with your own conclusions about things. So recognize the fact that for historians don't see this as a cut and dry matter. Historians actually debate this often, and there are many levels of the historiography here that you guys can study in terms of whether Reconstruction was successful, unsuccessful, or again, somewhere in between. I tend to think of it as a full-on failure. And the reason why I suggest that, you can talk as much as you want about the amendments that were put on the books in terms of African American rights, particularly political and citizenship rights. But if you can't use those political and citizenship rights for nearly 100 years, how is Reconstruction successful? But yet there's others who would argue, well, would we have actually put those amendments on the books in the 1950s, the 1960s, and the 1970s? Or would African Americans have still been fighting for a political citizenship by that point? So that's a great point. It's an important point, right? So for you guys, the idea here is to recognize the fact that you can come down in one of these positions yourself, right? You can say that Reconstruction was a success and discuss why. You can say that Reconstruction was a full-on failure and discuss why. Or you can come down somewhere in the middle, right? You can say, well, again, because of these political rights that they were given, even though the federal government didn't enforce these rights, that somehow by the time we get to the 50s, 60s, and 70s in the 20th century, we clearly see that those amendments are on the books, right? And you can make the argument, like many historians do, that would we even have been able to get those amendments on the books in the middle of the 20th century? And therefore, African Americans would have been fighting for the same exact thing that they had fought for in terms of the Civil War, and then Abraham Lincoln had helped them to get, and the radical Republicans had helped them to get, right? So you can really make a great deal of arguments about it. As a historian, I'm able to make an argument for each one of these things, right? And I think the more nuanced way of being a historian, or the more nuanced way of being a critical student, a critical thinker, is to be able to make those three different arguments, right? And to come down almost like a lawyer, right? Somebody presents something to you and you find a way to make an argument regardless of how it is that you feel about it, right? But I would suggest for you guys, the idea here for you is to really create a narrative for yourself that is your own. And so I don't want you to think about all three different scenarios and to be able to make an argument for each. It would be great if you could. But I do want you to grab one of these things and to say, this is my opinion. This is why I believe in this opinion, and be able to tell me what it is that you feel are the most important points that drive home your main conclusion, right? Which is whether or not Reconstruction was something that was successful, something that had failed, or something that was somewhere in between, right? And this is something that you're going to have to do in terms of the final assignment. So I really want you guys to be able to recognize this course again as we've moved through it as something that's really supposed to push you in terms of your critical thinking, and to stop throwing a narrative at you, to have you, read about multiple different facets of the narrative and multiple different interpretations of the narrative, and then be able to cobble those things together for yourself so that you have your own personal interpretation, right? So Reconstruction is just one of those things that we've talked about in the course. You really should, for each one of these eras, really be able to create for yourself your own interpretation. So an interpretation of the era before the Civil War in terms of slavery, territorial expansion, and things like that. Then also your own interpretation of the Civil War itself. Then your own interpretation of Reconstruction. Right? So let's move forward and let's talk a little bit about the middle, and therefore the end eventually of the Reconstruction period. Well, in 1867, Ulysses S. Grant is elected President of the United States, taking office in 1868. He will become president once again. He will actually have two terms, giving him a full 8 years to really hopefully work out Reconstruction, right? And when Grant becomes the president, there's this great feeling of hope, right? That he's going to be this individual who can mediate this situation that he steps into. There's radical Republicans over here and moderate Republicans over there and Southern Democrats over here, some of them that are quite moderate, others who are teetering on that edge of Southern redemption and wanting to go back to old times. So he really is placed smack dab in the middle of a very chaotic political situation. Well, obviously, as we know, in this chaotic political situation, eventually somebody's going to win out, right? Well, it's not the radical Republicans. And what actually happens during Grant's presidency is that radicalism is going to start dying out. It's not just going to start dying out within the larger political system, it'll start dying out within the Republican Party, too. One of the reasons for this is the fact that people just kind of got tired of what was going on, right? People just got to the point where they didn't want this constant upheaval. And one of the unfortunate points of this is that they didn't want upheaval that was based on the rights of African Americans. And they get to a point where they're like, why are we concerned about this anymore? You know, there are amendments on the books, so why are we concerned about it anymore? If the federal government or the state governments cannot enforce these issues, then, you know, what does it matter to me? It doesn't matter to me at all. So, you know, it's basically this idea of, well, the job is done, right? African Americans have been emancipated and that's that. And people don't want to move forward from that. They don't want consistent upheaval. They've already had enough upheaval with the Civil War. Why do we have to continue to have this upheaval? So that's one of the reasons why this radicalism dies out. There's also a great deal of issues in the North that are occurring in this second half of the 19th century that's really going to promote capitalism in the North. And economics, as many of you who study history know, economics often play a significant role in social issues and even in cultural issues. And in terms of this latter half of the 19th century, the North is going to become industrialized. And even by the 1870s, most people talk about industrialization, or the sort of the height of early industrialization for North America particularly, as being closer to the turn of the century, right? Well, it's really the 1870s, isn't it? It's really that point in time in the 1870s where you have the Transcontinental Railroad, and you have the telegraph, and you have steam engines, and you have all of these things that are changing the way people communicate with each other, the way people are able to transport their own bodies, let alone the way that they transport goods that they are able to either create, say grow, in terms of agriculture, or they're able to create in factories, or natural resources going toward factories, right? So in the North, capitalism really takes hold. And one of the issues with capitalism in the North in this period, and this early and sort of middle of the industrialized period for the 19th and somewhat in the early 20th century, you're really going to see that capitalism becomes king. You know, we talk about cotton becoming king, right? Capitalism, industrialization becomes king in the North. And as industrialization becomes king, the idea here is that there's going to be a ruling class of the North. It's going to be of businessmen. It's going to be of people who own the manufacturing factories. It's going to be of people who are able to supply the goods to factories. This is where we're getting very close to the steel magnates, right? So we're going to see in this point in time that for the North, during the Civil War, before the Civil War, there was this significant focus on something called the free labor ideology. And the free labor ideology is that you give your workers as much leeway as possible. You pay your workers as much as you possibly can, because in paying your laborers and in giving them something to be proud of in terms of, you know, how much they're earning or what it is that they're putting out there into the market, that this is really something that pushes them to new heights in terms of their productivity. And it allows for a society that really is harmonious, right? People feel as though they're all working toward a very common goal, and everybody's getting a slice of the pie, right? Well, as capitalism heightens in the North and industrialism heightens in the North, there's obviously going to be a ruling class that is created, and that ruling class is going to be looking down on what's called the subordinate masses. And that subordinate group of people are really going to be those individuals who they used to talk about in the North as being free laborers. And the free labor ideology was something that the North prided itself on, because they were saying, you know, we have free laborers, and look how much they're a part of the system, and look how much they want to work for us because of the fact that they get a slice of the pie. This is not what you have in the South. And they look down on Southerners, not just in terms of these racial issues, but also kind of saying to Southerners, you know, the more you give to your laborers, the more that you allow your laborers to be part of the larger system, and the more freedom you give your laborers, then the better off your economic system is going to be. Now we fast forward and we get to the point where Northerners are kind of getting the idea of having a ruling class, having subordinate masses, still free people, obviously, in terms of the subordinate masses, but we start thinking about the idea in the North of, well, here's a group of people who run the show. And then we have these people who are the workers. And the workers are just the people who put the parts together. Or they're the people who call things in the field. They're the people who load things onto the trains. They're the people who package things for distribution. But we, as a part of this ruling class, are the people who are, for lack of a better term, we are the gods, right? We talk about these gods and kings of industry eventually. This is where this comes from. And so this heightened capitalism of the North is really going to get Northerners, especially people in terms of that ruling class, thinking about the idea that you don't want to give too many rights to people regardless of their race, right? You won't want to give too much freedom to people because you want to be able not only to maintain this understanding of being a ruling class, being somewhat like a Southern plantation owner, you also start thinking about the fact that you don't want the subordinate masses to get power, because if the subordinate masses get power, or if they get a bigger piece of the pie, then what happens to you in terms of not only your money, but your ability to quote-unquote run the show, right? So this shift is really what's going to push away people like the radical Republicans, who not only believed in African American rights, but believed significantly in free labor ideology. So you can see another way that the radicals start to be pushed away. Tiredness of what's going on, number one, in terms of the social system and the political system, and then also the sense of heightened capitalism that's changing the way Northerners think about the class system in the United States. Now, who's swept up in all of this? Obviously, Ulysses S. Grant. And Grant really was somebody who really very much believed in the idea of not only these civil rights laws that were being put on the books, but he also believed in federal enforcement of them. He believed that if there was an amendment to the Constitution and it said that there were political rights that were granted to African Americans, full citizenship rights, and they had the right to vote, that darn it, the American military needs to get down there, and it really needs to make sure that this is happening in the South. And so for Grant, it really was, you know, here I am, I'm this masterful military leader, and now I'm the commander-in-chief, and I believe that there are certain points of the Constitution that need to be upheld, and therefore I believe that the federal government and the American military should be taking care of these things. I think we should be enforcing it not only in the court system, but also enforcing it again in terms of those districts that we talked about, in military districts. And so for Grant, it was really a time of turmoil for him, because this is what he believed in politically, but it wasn't something that he was able to get done. He eventually loses a great deal of political capital, and it's because of all of these things that I've talked about before in terms of the radical Republicans being pushed away, and obviously the radical Republicans were going to, even though he was moderate, were going to support him because he believed in this enforcement issue. So he loses a great deal of political capital and all of this chaos and turmoil in the political system. He loses political capital because the radical Republicans were very interested in him and very interested in helping, and his hopes really falter, not only for his presidency in terms of Reconstruction, but for Reconstruction as a whole. The people who will further undermine him are those people that I just talked about before, which are the Southern Redeemers, and those are the people who are looking to their Southern Democrats, and they're sort of a disparate group of people, businessmen and wealthy landowners and people like that. And they band together and they want to redeem the South. They want to go back to the old South, and they really are not interested in African American rights, and anything that they can do to get rid of African American rights or to make sure that African Americans are not able to take advantage of their rights, they will do it. So these Southern Redeemers actually get a good deal of political capital themselves in this period. And in 1874, there is a huge shift in terms of Southern Democrats being able to get a great deal of power in Congress, and guess who's a part of these Southern Democrats that are elected in? Many of them are Southern Redeemers and those redemptionists, okay? So this is really for Ulysses S. Grant. This is his presidency in a nutshell, basically, is that here's a guy who comes in, he's very interested in upholding the things that the radical Republicans have put out there for African Americans, and he's unable to do what he wants to do because of the fact that the political system is changing. And the South is, in a few short years, able to get a great deal of political capital back for itself, particularly in Congress. So this is where we sit in terms of Ulysses S. Grant. So let's talk a little bit more about the social issues of this period and what actually happens for African Americans. Well, we talked last time about the Black Codes and the creation of the Black Codes and how horrific these codes were for African Americans, because they not only were losing a great deal of the newfound freedoms and also newfound rights that they had, I hate to use this term, had been given, because I like to think of African American agency, but truly the American government gave these rights to them via the amendments, right? So that's what I mean by give this to them. So we know that for African Americans, after the Black Codes were put in place, state after state after state in the South, even in some of the border states that were on the fence in terms of the Civil War and in terms of seceding from the Union, that all of these Black Codes, again, the taking away of freedom, the taking away of rights again from African Americans. So we know the fact that African Americans very early on in the Reconstruction period were just, as hard as many of them fought in terms of not only being able to vote, but also being able to participate in the political process, and being a part of state congresses and being a part of the American Congress. There really was this, by the time you get to, say, 1866, 1867, really the early years here, you can already see these rights dwindling. And even though there are people who are serving in the state congresses for quite some time who are African Americans, by a certain point in time, this is nothing that can happen anymore. They're not unseated, but they're not going to be able to win re-election. And so for African Americans, you can see that great hope of the post-Civil War era becoming something that on a daily basis dwindles more and more and more. And these Black Codes, again, as we talked about them, some of them are chained again, quote unquote, to the fields that they used to work. Many of them are brought up on trumped up charges, so that they're then put back in the fields and are forced to work for maybe not their former plantation owner, but maybe another plantation down the road from where they worked. We know that they're segregated. We know that all of these strides that they make in terms of their community, even though they're able to keep their communities intact, They're not able to make money. They're not able to live as freely as they wanted to live, or to be able to take advantage of the rights that the federal government was presenting to them. And so one of the things that comes with the Black Codes is violence. And in terms of the violence that's perpetrated by the Black Codes, that would be the rounding up of African Americans, the beating of African Americans who were being put up on these trumped up charges to be put back in the fields. Just the fact that, again, if African American men were found to be talking, or even get anywhere near a white woman, they would be severely beaten. They would be taken to jail. Again, trumped up charges here. Find a charge that we can stick them with, and then put them back out in the field. So there's a great deal of violence that comes with the Black Codes, but there's no greater violence than the creation of the Ku Klux Klan. And the Ku Klux Klan, as we know in the modern day, is still in operation. Very under the radar in terms of particular places in the United States, but in many places in the United States, they hold some pretty significant public rallies. But in the post-Civil War era, we really see, the Ku Klux Klan originates in Tennessee. It originates right after the war in 1865. But state by state by state in the South has chapters of the Ku Klux Klan very quickly and very rapidly after the war. Their basic goal was to deny blacks a role in white society. It wasn't just to deny blacks their civil and political rights. It wasn't the goal to strip them of the citizenship that they were just given. It wasn't just to re-enslave them in a way that wasn't necessarily the same as being a slave before emancipation, but to somewhat re-enslave them within the agricultural system. It wasn't just about that. It was this larger overarching goal, deny African Americans a chance, deny African Americans the ability to really even be a part of white society. And again, this spreads rapidly over the South. And the Ku Klux Klan, you can see their burning cross here. They in the 20th century were still putting burning crosses on African American families' lawns right in front of their homes. People who were quote unquote sympathizers in terms of African Americans who were white, they would get the crosses put on their lawns and burned. And what a symbol to use, right? What a symbol to set on fire, and to create fear with, right? So for African Americans in the South, the violence of the Black Codes was very specific, but the violence in terms of the Ku Klux Klan was very broad. It was very overarching. It was very ran the gamut from beatings to hangings to stabbings. It was the thing that you feared as an African American who lived in the South. And again, fearing this not just in the 1860s, 1870s, 1890s, but all the way into the 30s, 40s, 50s, and even part of the 60s in the South. And again, still there, in the 1980s when I was growing up, you still saw many of these things too. But their height here really is this period after the war up to the civil rights movement in the 1950s, that very main civil rights movement that we talk about in terms of history. So for African Americans, this was the thing to fear, right? And this was about intimidation. It was about intimidating African Americans to stop them from being able to do the things that they had created for themselves, not just in terms of, post-Civil War communities, but also in terms of things that they had created for themselves while they were enslaved. And we talked a lot about that in terms of the Low Country, the marketplace African Americans, the people who were able to make money for themselves, or the churches that were created. And then we know the fact that African Americans, when they are fully emancipated, run toward creating these communities for themselves that are based in the church, that are based in education, right? Creating their own businesses, farms, things like that. But that's really what the Ku Klux Klan focuses on. It focuses on destroying these communities that they've built. It focuses on initially routing out these community leaders and then maybe undermining the community underneath those leaders, right? And then it, of course, spreads to, well, let's forget about the leaders, because African American communities are actually very strong. And in terms particularly of their churches, in terms particularly of their educational societies, are extremely strong. And this is something that the Ku Klux Klan recognized, was just taking the leaders away and doing something to the leaders was not going to break the community. So then they obviously spread to violence against just regular members of the African American community. But when they were focusing on community leaders and focusing on this idea of breaking apart the community, they focused on reverends. They focused on members of the state governments and local governments. They focused on educators. They focused on people who were business owners or they were landowners. And again, that was supposed to sort of take away the foundation of the African American community. Didn't. But this was about intimidation, right? So that's the first focus, and then the next focus is clearly just widespread violence against African Americans. Also, making sure that African Americans did not vote, making sure that they were not able to get to the polls, making sure that they were threatened so that they wouldn't go to the polls. And as I mentioned, also they terrorized whites who supported them, who helped African Americans try to get to the polls to vote. So the Ku Klux Klan is just, their violence is just terribly widespread. Violence is terrible regardless, but this is domestic terrorism at its worst in the United States, right? A group of people, a massive group of people, trying to take away not only political and civil rights, not just trying to take away citizenship issues, but trying to take away the lives of African Americans. So this really was something that was not only an issue for African Americans in terms of fear, anxieties, things like that, but also very, very hard for Southerners who supported African Americans to stop it. And one of the things that I find is really interesting is that as there would be a federal gain. So as there would be, say, the next amendment was passed, there would be a spike in the violence. And then the violence would sort of dissipate. And then something else would happen for African Americans, and the violence would spike again. And it got to the point where, this is the point here for us, is to make sure that there aren't any more gains, right? And that we can terrorize African Americans enough to the point where they don't even want any more. And they don't fight the fact that they're going to get things taken away from them. Now, the federal government tries to nip some of these things in the bud, and one of the ways that they try to do this is called the Force Acts. There's some in 1870, the majority in 1871, and the idea here is that they make it a federal crime. It's a law that's created. It's a federal crime that if you impede access to civil rights, doesn't matter if it's African American, doesn't matter who it is, if you're going to impede someone's civil rights, then it is a federal crime and you're going to be prosecuted for it. Again, this is going to be another issue that another law that does not work. Enforcement of it does not work. It not only does not work because I have here that, here the Democratic Party often sponsored the Klan, so it's not going to work on a state basis, and the state's asking for help from the federal government. But again, in terms of what I talked about with Ulysses S. Grant, not really being able to enforce these laws because of the fact that the political climate in Washington is changing so much. So we can see here that African Americans' lives are very, very different in terms of what they thought they were going to be after 1865, and then what was actually happening by the time we get to 1868, 1869, and well beyond in the 1870s. And the 1870s is just a terrible time for African Americans in the South, moving much closer to Reconstruction coming to a full end. Well, in the early 1870s, the United States is going to have a significant economic crisis on its hand. And why are we talking about this in terms of Reconstruction? Well, as I mentioned earlier, economics often plays a significant role in terms of the political system of the United States, social system of the United States, and also the cultural system of the United States. And the reason why it's important for Reconstruction is economics is really going to, the crisis in terms of economics is really going to push Reconstruction off to the side even more, right? So number one, in the South, even though Southerners aren't happy about the fact that the United States in itself particularly is having some significant economic troubles, it is going to be happy that the focus is going to be pushed off of Reconstruction, and that people are not going to have the time, they're not going to have the brain power, and they're also not going to have the money to focus on the Reconstruction period, that economics are really going to trump Reconstruction. The reason why this is important in terms of the North is that obviously, as we talked about before, people are getting tired of Reconstruction. They're tired of the turmoil. There are people who are becoming a part of the political system who are able to thwart efforts in terms of Reconstruction. But these economic issues are going to force the Grant administration, is going to force those members of Congress who are interested in Reconstruction and really making Reconstruction successful, that the economic issues are going to force them to be focused on something else other than Reconstruction. And it's not just going to force them in terms of financial issues, not being able to put the money toward Reconstruction, but it's also just going to be, I have something else I need to focus on here. This is a crisis, and this is an economic crisis. And as we all know, in the United States, an economic crisis really trumps almost anything else in terms of the political system, except for that one thing of national security, right? So when we have an economic crisis on our hands, people don't talk as much about social issues. They don't talk as much about cultural issues. And unfortunately for African Americans, this is what happen. So this is another nail in the coffin of Reconstruction. The Panic of 1873 is what I'm talking about. It actually was the Great Depression. It was called the Great Depression until 1929 and the stock market crash and the Great Depression of the 1930s in the United States. So it really, just that title alone is going to tell you how important the Panic of 1873 was, is that for numerous years later, there was never anything like it, even though there were depressions between then and 1929. The panic is really going to stop that significant economic expansion of the United States, which will then pick up again, and we'll have industrialization in the 1880s and particularly the 1890s. But it really is a point in time where everything stops dead. So the post-war economic expansion for the North is really going to end. The panic really is caused by inflation after the war. It's caused by a significant trade deficit that's created. There is the railroad speculation issues that Foner talks about, and then also there's a significant strain on banks that occurs because of all of these things that then allows for the bottom to really drop out of the American economic markets. So I want you to read about this in terms of Foner. I won't belabor the points here. What I really want you to know, number one, is the fact that, again, the reason why this is tied to Reconstruction is that it pushes Reconstruction off to the side, and we know why it pushes Reconstruction off to the side, unfortunately. In the South, the reason why I want you to know this is because of the fact that, again, we talked about before the Civil War, we talked about the early post-Civil War era, that the South, in terms of its lack of industrialization, and then what happened to it during the war in terms of its urban centers being pretty much decimated, that the South is really reeling from what has happened in terms of its inability to industrialize, and then also what the North did to it during the war. We also see that in the 1870s, the revenue from cotton, which cotton was king, right? The revenue from cotton is cut in half. We see that those staple crops of tobacco, rice, and sugar are really going to be falling in terms of sales too. And the fact that they just can't pick themselves up in terms of reindustrializing, in terms of that little bit of industrialization that they had done before the war, that they really can't pick up from that either. And this makes the Panic of 1873 terrible and horrific for the South. And this is going to, again, in terms of Reconstruction issues, this is going to ramp up what they do to African Americans. And the reason why? Fear, right? Fear of African Americans taking their jobs, fear of African Americans who had any money whatsoever, fear of this idea that African Americans were somehow going to, quote unquote, get ahead of them. right? But especially this idea that African Americans were taking their jobs, right? If somebody in the South had fallen on such hard times that they needed to go out and work in the fields themselves, well, they couldn't because there was an African American doing the job, right? So again, in the South, one of those things where it's kind of an oxymoron of you put somebody in the fields and then you want to take them out of the fields because you need the job in the field, right? And so for the South, the economic problems of the Panic of 1873 are again going to, ramp up their violence, ramp up their hatred of African Americans, and really cause life for African Americans to get worse than it was. Again, in terms of Reconstruction, in terms of the North, in terms of the federal government, again, pushing Reconstruction off to the side. So that's why Foner talks so much about the economic troubles of this period, okay? So let's move forward and let's talk about the very specific end of Reconstruction. So we've obviously been working toward the full-on end of Reconstruction, right? And Reconstruction ends rather abruptly with the Compromise of 1877, which we'll talk about in a minute. But we've obviously been working toward this, right? So Northerners really becoming weary of the chaos. People in the South, really being able to trump what the federal government wanted to do in the South by using violence, by using tactics to keep African Americans away from the polls, by just showing the North that they could, because they were so easily let back into the Union, because eventually they're able to create significant power for themselves in the National Congress, that it really illustrates to the North that Southern Republicans really are able to not only create great political power for themselves, but it's sort of like the South really thumbing its nose to the North and certainly to the federal government and saying, you can't stop us from doing what it is that we want to do in our own region. You can't stop us from doing what we want to do in our own state. And the fact that the federal government could not, for obviously these variety of reasons that we've talked about, could not uphold these amendments, could not uphold these laws, it could not help African Americans in the way that it wanted to, that it really illustrated to the North that Reconstruction had failed in many ways, and in the South that they had triumphed. And this is why many historians will talk about the idea of who really won this war, right? It's the peace of the war where the war is typically won, isn't it? We talk about this in terms of military history, in terms of who wins the war. But the winner of the war isn't always the winner of the peace. And for this particular war, the winner of the peace clearly is the South. It clearly is those Southern Democrats, those people who are a part of the South who are against, and this obviously was the vast majority at this point in time, people of the South who were afraid of African Americans, who despised African Americans, who thought of African Americans as inferior, and so on and so on and so on, right? So we really get to this point where the South really trumps the North in terms of Reconstruction. So how does it end, right? What's the very end point here? We know that Southern Republicans in the South okay, that's a bit much. The Southern Republicans really were tired of being retaliated against, and certainly once the KKK was in there, they certainly got tired of being concerned for their family, their children, all of that. So they stop pushing so hard for African Americans. Northerners become tired of the expenses of Reconstruction, not just those social, cultural expenses that we talked about, but also in terms of the financial expenses of Reconstruction. Many Northerners also started to turn their heads away from African Americans because they started believing what Southerners were telling them about blacks, telling them about how blacks lived, telling them about how blacks worshiped, telling them about all of these lies about African Americans that were not true. And these were not things that anything that Southerners would tell Northerners about African Americans clearly was not something that you could put your hand on the Bible and say, oh, this is absolutely true, right? Obviously not. They obviously had an ulterior motive, and some Southerners actually succumbed to these ulterior motives. We also know that in terms of the upholding of rights, this is going to dwindle, especially federally. Again, this has to do with a lot of things, but also, the death knell for upholding these rights clearly was the Panic of 1873. And then we have the power of blacks dwindling all through this time as well, to the point where African Americans only have power within their own communities. They lose political power. They lose their power as a part of larger society, and that just pretty much is pushed away for them. The election of 1876 is really going to be what puts the end to Reconstruction in terms of politics. The Compromise of 1877 is what is actually going to change the outcome of the election of 1876. Now, the election of 1876 was between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel J. Tilden. And when the electoral votes were counted, there were actually disputes in 4 states in terms of who got the electoral votes. And these states were South Carolina and Louisiana and Florida, and I believe the other one is Oregon. I can't put my finger on it right now, but I believe it was Oregon. And so the dispute over these electoral votes, the Democratic Party in each one of these states would say, or the party rather, in each one of these states would actually say, well, Hayes won, or Tilden won. Okay, and so in terms of the Democratic Party, they're going to say in that state that Tilden won the electoral votes. In the Republican Party, in that particular state, they're going to say that Hayes won. Okay, so the only way that the presidency can be awarded to anyone is to compromise. And the Compromise of 1877 actually gave all of the electoral votes to Rutherford B. Hayes, who was a Republican. And interestingly enough, the Republicans, in being able to get the presidency and to actually keep the presidency, the issue for them is that we're not going to trade our political power here, but in trying to keep the presidency in the Republican Party, make sure that a Democrat doesn't become the president of the United States, they decide in this compromise that they're going to give the South what it really wants. And what it really wants is for federal troops to leave the South. And in leaving the South, the last point of being able to make sure that the rights of African Americans were upheld would be gone. And that really allows for those Southern redeemers, those Democrats in the Southern states, to regain all of the power that they wanted, right? It allowed them to have state power, and again, it allowed them to get even greater power within the federal government. And there you go, right? This is how Reconstruction ends. This is where, this is that last piece of the puzzle, right? To have it over with. And Southerners are elated. Maybe the Democrat isn't president of the United States, but man, did we get what we wanted here. And for Northerners, it was, well, sorry about Reconstruction, but at least the Republican retains the presidency, right? And so the Republican Party is able to hold on to the presidency. It's able to hold on to power in terms of the federal government, at least the head of the federal government, the executive branch of the federal government. Again, it's losing a great deal of power in terms of the Congress, or if it's not losing the power, the Republicans are actually conceding a lot to Democrats at this point. So it's over, right? It's totally over. And what happens after the end of Reconstruction? Well, let's not talk about the Black Codes anymore. Let's talk about the Jim Crow era, okay? And we know about this in terms of any studies that you had even in high school in terms of the 20th century, right? The Jim Crow era is where, this is where oppression of African Americans is just full force, right? Social segregation of African Americans. This is where the drinking fountain issue comes in. This is where the bathroom issue comes in. This is where, you can't come into this restaurant, you're African American. It was already there in many different shades, right? But at this point, it's no holds barred. And it is basically, African Americans live in this section of town, and you don't come anywhere near whites. Jim Crow is just the symbol. The Jim Crow era is just the full symbol of the oppression of African Americans in the South. And all of this is sponsored, condoned, or ignored by the government, not only in terms of the Southern state governments, but also in terms of Northern governments, and then obviously the federal government. And it really is the point in time where everything just falls to pieces in terms of Reconstruction. And again, as I mentioned to you before, take this for what it is to you. Is this complete failure in terms of Reconstruction? Is this, is there success in Reconstruction? Is there, do you teeter on that line? But this is where all of this comes to a head for you, right? To make the decision to create your own understanding of Reconstruction and to say, this is what I would argue. This is what I quote unquote believe, right? In terms of what I have learned here, in terms of the interpretations that I have in front of me, this is how I think Reconstruction not only went down, but what I think the significance is of Reconstruction and whether or not it was successful or not. And again, somewhere in the middle, right? So this really is where you hit this point where you need to make the decision. And as I mentioned to you guys before, I actually think Reconstruction was a full failure. And it's a failure of the federal government. It's a failure of politicians. It's a failure of northern citizens, right? It's obviously a failure of the southern citizens of the United States, but it's definitely a failure of those people who, even abolitionists, who just kind of, they tried very hard, but they just kind of let it go eventually, right? But again, my interpretation, right? What's your interpretation? So let's move on to this last slide here, and we'll talk a little bit about something that I think is very interesting in terms of Foner's book and connects really well to his thesis. So here's the Foner quote that I pulled out of the book, and I think it's really a very important thing. It really shows you what Foner was trying to do with this book on Reconstruction. It wasn't just about giving you the blow by blow, right? He really did have a point to this. And so he says 1877 marked a decisive retreat from the idea, born during the Civil War, of a powerful nation state protecting the fundamental rights of all American citizens. And so this is really what he was trying to do with this book, right? Was to illustrate to people that the Civil War, and even just before it in terms of President Lincoln, that the point was to eventually create for the United States this large, overarching understanding that the national government would do anything in its power to protect everyone's rights. Now, how long does it take us to get to this point, right? Are we even at that point in the era in which we live today? And again, these are all things that I want you guys to figure out for yourselves. And this is where, if you're going to stretch it to the present day, this is where, personal opinion and educated personal opinion comes in, right? But for Foner, this is what this era was about. And he shows that being ripped apart in this book. He shows there's promise, and then he shows the devolution of the promise, the devolution of Reconstruction, right? And so it really truly is his point here. And I find this period of time to be very heartbreaking, and I find this period of time in United States history to just be very sad, right? That we were on the cusp of something so very important, and then it just kind of dwindled away. That African Americans were on the cusp of something that they wouldn't at least get the chance at again for, they don't get the chance for it again until the 50s. But we really don't see the culmination of a lot of the civil rights movement until the 70s and the 80s. And so it does, as I say here, it takes African Americans nearly 100 more years of endurance and struggle to finally get back what was rightfully theirs. And not just rightfully theirs in terms of the amendments and in terms of what the Constitution said was rightfully theirs, but also in terms of basic human rights. And so this is where we stand in the class, right? This is really what we've been working toward, is what is this period about? We started out with the pre-Civil War period to understand what was the Civil War about? Why was the Civil War started? We have these very particular points where the war explodes, right? But what was it before the war? What was the lead up? And obviously, as I say, all points lead back to slavery, right? But there are so many points underneath that blanket and on that umbrella, right? There's all of that. There's this blanket statement about slavery. Well, what are all the other issues? So all roads do lead back to slavery in terms of the origins of the Civil War. But what else is going on? And then we moved into the Civil War itself. And as you know from my lecture and also from the Catan book, it's really important to understand the blow by blow, right? The most important thing to understand about the military aspects of the Civil War is that, if you're going to talk about it in a nutshell, that the South started out with people thinking it didn't have the upper hand, right? That the North was just going to overtake them. Lincoln thought this too. Bam, snap your fingers, it'd be over. And the South was able to thwart that idea. The South was able to have that defensive war and to force the North into the offensive war and to string them along. But the one thing that the Southerners didn't count on, other than the fact that, as hell-bent as they were to move forward with the war, as hell-bent as they were to deprive African Americans of even freedom, that at some point in that war they'd get tired. And then on top of that, they really didn't recognize the fact that eventually the North would get its act together and it would change the Anaconda Plan and it would really expand it in many ways. And it would create this total war aspect and it would create the war of attrition. And I don't think that the South thought that the North had that in them. And I don't think that the South thought that particularly Abraham Lincoln had that in him. And so that's really what that era was about, right? You can get into all of the military aspects of this, but the Civil War itself. So, what was that war about? Well, obviously it was, again, like I said, about slavery and about, all roads leading back to slavery. But what was the war itself about? Like, how did the war go from, point to point in terms of who had the upper hand and who didn't have the upper hand and back and forth and back and forth? How does the war, many wars do this, it's cascading, right? One side has the upper hand, the next day the other side has the upper hand, right? So in terms of this war, we see a little bit of that cascading in the middle. But by the time we get close to, once we move beyond some of the middle points in terms of battle, all of a sudden the North really hits the nail on the head, right, in terms of strategy, and there we go. So you have an upper hand, and then in terms of the beginning of the war, and then by the end of the war, who really obviously has the upper hand when they actually win the war in the North. So then we move to this next period, right? And we move to the idea of Reconstruction. What is Reconstruction period all about? So the Reconstruction period is all about the idea of, granting African American more rights than the issue of emancipation, of trying to envelop the South back into the Union of the United States of America, and then after that, being able to make sure that African Americans had access to those rights that they were given during this period. And we can see how that really is very chaotic to start with. There's chaos from the get-go, and then we can see how that chaos really takes over Reconstruction. Then what are you supposed to do with all of this information, right? Well, you're supposed to link all of these eras together, so you can really see, we have this starting point of slavery being a significant institution in the United States, particularly in the southern United States, and then we get all the way to this point where there's some strides that are made, and obviously emancipation has been created, freedom has been created, but we get to this particular point where it's like, well, how far could we go, and what does that mean for at least the United States of America in this period, right? How did we get to the point where, here we're working so hard for freedom, we're working so hard for rights for African Americans, and then we get to this point where it's shut off, right? So that's what you're going to do here, right? You're going to put all of those things together, okay? And for your final assignment, all of this stuff really needs to inform that historical question that I was talking about. And you're going to see in terms of the discussion that I have for the assignment, you're going to see that in terms of being able to recognize that all of this needs to be strung together in your mind in terms of a narrative in order to answer your historical question, right? So that's where we'll end here. But obviously, as I mentioned, I really feel like this is a very sad moment in American history. This closes something that started out very hopefully and ends on a very sour note, right? But that's it for the course in terms of discussion. I hope that you enjoyed the discussion. I know for the middle portion of the course it was a great deal of lecture, but I hope that the discussions on bookending that were interesting to you, and not something where you felt like you were being lectured at, that it was very much as much of a discussion as it can be in terms of just me being the one doing the talking, right? But to kind of get you guys to recognize the points that I want you to pick up on, but what I want you to do with those points for yourself, right? What is it that you need to do in terms of understanding this larger narrative, okay? So thank you for participating in this course. I have very much enjoyed it, and I've enjoyed many of my communications with all of you, and I've also enjoyed many of the journal entries too. So take care and good luck with the final assignments that we have for the course. Take care.